She assumed no one would notice if she canceled the Queen's memorial. No papers, no journalists, just silent instructions going down the line. Take down the wreath, take down the chairs, and discontinue the custom to make place for her. But Sergeant Corin Ashwell didn't complain when he saw the Queen's candlelight vigil taken down for a Camilla charity dinner. He didn't talk to HR. He stood in the way of the woman who wanted to erase her memory. And when Camilla showed up in person and labeled the Queen's legacy sentimental clutter, he delivered 10 words that shook Windsor to its core. Before we show you the moment the guard refused to step aside, make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have the bell icon turned on. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from, and stay right here because today, the monarchy tried to erase its own memory, but the royal guard wouldn't let them. The light in the morning at Windsor Castle was cold and sharp, the kind that made every edge of stone sharper, got stuck in the wrinkles of metal buckles, and didn't leave any place for softness. The courtyard smelt like snow and limestone, like the past frozen in time. Drill formations walked across the green almost perfectly, with guns on their shoulders and gloved hands steady. No one yelled orders. They had already practiced every stride and every pause until they knew them by heart. Sergeant Corin Ashwell strolled around the edge without saying anything. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make a shoulder tighter, or a spine straighter. The men knew what today was. The same thing that has happened every October since the Queen died. There was never any publicity for the yearly memorial. There were no cameras, no journalists, and no plaques placed up afterward to show what had been done. There were only guards, stillness, and a wreath at the foot of the Queen's chapel window. It was the only ceremonial event that Her Majesty directly authorized before she died. It was a simple homage, not a grand one. Corin had stood up for all of them. He was at Helmond on duty when the Queen died. When I came back 2 weeks later, Windsor had changed. It was quieter and heavier, like someone had taken all the clocks away and no one knew what time it was anymore. Princess Anne read the decree out loud the first year while standing in the chapel entryway, with her coat still soaked from the rain. For as long as the guards march, she shall be remembered privately, properly. Corin remembered those words better than any battle debriefing he'd ever had. He was halfway through checking out the left formation when he saw them. 2 royal aides in gray jackets, with clipboards in their hands, and a serious look on their faces. They walked around like they didn't belong in the courtyard. Corin saw them, but the guards didn't. They stopped just within the archway made of marble. As Corin got closer, the taller one cleared his throat. "Sergeant Ashwell," he said, reading straight from the page in his palm as if it would keep him safe. "By order of Her Majesty, the Queen Consort, I am informing you that the scheduled memorial ceremony is to be postponed indefinitely, effective immediately." The aide didn't mean for the remarks to echo so loudly. Even the guards at the end of the square looked to the side. Corin didn't blink. "Who signed it?" the aide stammered. The younger one answered, "It's a verbal directive." His voice broke a little. "Issued this morning. The Queen Consort says that the monarchy needs to look ahead. The Queen herself wouldn't have wanted sentimentality to get in the way of the future." There was a long silence between them. A gull called out from somewhere above, and then disappeared below the roof of the chapel. Then Corin moved ahead by 1 step. "That's not feeling," he remarked in a low, steady voice. "That's service." He turned and gave a clear instruction. "Continue formation," and the practice started again, with the weapons clicking back into sync. The helpers jumped as if they had just walked into real fire. "You're going against an order," the taller one stated, seeming more scared now. Corin said, "No, I'm waiting for it to be written down." The aides looked at each other, then moved back and whispered as they left. One of them whispered something that Corin couldn't quite hear, but he could tell what it was. The sound. The younger one remarked, "He's taking it personally." Corin turned just enough for them to see his face. "Damn right I am," he said under his breath. He continued walking across the courtyard, his boots cutting through the frost with purpose. A soldier held formation not for show, but for memory, and nothing was going to move him without proof. The halls of Windsor were quieter than normal, but not in a good way. It wasn't the respectful silence of history breathing through limestone. This kind of quiet, pushed against doors, adhered on tapestries, and filled the spaces between footsteps like something that needed to be uttered but wasn't written down. Corin walked across the palace like a soldier in enemy territory, not outwardly hostile, yet vigilant, watchful, and listening for the sound beneath the sound. He walked by junior aides who were talking in hushed voices near the registry alcove. "She thinks it's out of date," one person added, holding a stack of printed briefings. "She called it grief theater, and she said it hurts the family's reputation in public. She really did say that I was there. The palace should quit living in the shadow of a 96-year-old woman's rule, they said. Corin kept walking and didn't stop, but his jaw was so tight that it hurt. He turned the corner into the west hallway and walked toward the small conference vestibule where the final details for the event were usually worked out. Through the open glass doors, he could hear the end of a conversation between event director Alistair Ridley and Camilla's press secretary, a thin man in a suit that looked like it had been ironed by a group of people. The secretary was flipping through something on his tablet and said, "It's just a candlelit wreath ceremony, not a state funeral. We need to get rid of some of these things before they become canon." Ridley thought for a moment. "I get it, but it's a cold stream event, not a press event, and you know how the senior guards are. She wants it gone," the secretary said. "No arguments, no pictures, just nothing." Ridley looked around nervously before seeing Corin's reflection in the exhibit glass. The press secretary turned too late, and Corin strode forward, boots perfect and voice steady. "Say that again." The man blinked. "Sorry." Corin didn't raise his voice. "Say it again. About how remembering things can be a pain. Sergeant Ashwell, this isn't your job," Ridley said as he raced in. "Then maybe it should be," Corin said sharply. He didn't look away. "If the press is changing what we guard, I want to know who I'm saluting." The secretary got angry. "Modernization is necessary. The palace needs to breathe again, says Her Majesty." Corin came closer, his voice low and angry. "It breathed because of her." Ridley raised his hands to calm the situation. "Sergeant, we're not getting rid of anything. It's only that modern monarchy needs to look ahead. Then walk forward without stepping on where she stood," Corin added. There was a beat of charged stillness, the kind that makes people remember where they were when they heard it. Ridley groaned. "There isn't any documentation if that's what you're looking for. The Queen Consort herself gave only verbal advice." Corin tilted his head, his voice sharp as steel. "Then it's not guidance, it's gossip with perfume." The line hit like a glass falling in a cathedral. Ridley stepped back, mumbling something about checking with legal. The press secretary tried to recover, but Corin was already turning, his cape brushing past like a drawn curtain. He walked toward the east windows, where the chapel's steeple rose through misted glass. The Queen's private memorial window stood empty and facing the courtyard, waiting. There was only 2 days till the ceremony, and someone had determined that the crown couldn't recall itself anymore. But Corin didn't ask for permission. Not anymore. The logistics office at Windsor was one of those places you weren't meant to notice. There were no velvet ropes or polished plaques, just walls of beige folders, humming printers, and the quiet rustle of a monarchy managed behind the scenes. It smelled like toner and old linen. It was the place where protocol was printed before it became history. Corin didn't knock when he entered, and the young clerk at the desk looked up, startled. "Sergeant, do you need something?" Corin stated. "I need everything for this year's memorial service, and I need it right now." The clerk paused. "There has been a..." Corin snapped. "I know, give me the paperwork." The clerk stood up and searched through a drawer labeled Royal Event Rotations, Q4. He found a thin, unsealed folder with one document inside. There were no signatures, departmental stamps, or household seals. Corin read the header out loud. Modernization Initiative QC Revision 3. He glanced through sentences that stood out in bloodless corporate font. Consolidate overlapping royal observances, eliminate annual redundancies across memorial protocols, and reposition narratives toward a living monarchy identity. His fingers curled around the page till it crumpled. "Reposition narratives," he said under his breath. "She's not editing a press release. She's changing the lady who held this family together." He looked at the bottom of the page. There was no royal crest, just 2 letters in italics, CR Camilla Regina. It wasn't even a command, it was a suggestion that looked like legislation. Corin gave the document back. "That paper isn't worth anything." The clerk opened his mouth, closed it, and then inquired in a hushed voice, "Was the Queen's ceremony official? I mean formally?" Corin didn't answer. He was already walking to the back wall where a closed filing cabinet with the House of Windsor's internal crest sat. "Access is limited." "I know the code," Corin replied. He typed it in. 4 digits. He opened the drawer marked Private Charters E2R and found what he needed in seconds. It was a single handwritten document that had been folded once and was still crisp despite the time. It was the late Queen's sharp pen that had written it. To the head of the household. "For one moment each year, we should not talk, explain, or frame anything. We should just remember. Let the guard march, let the wreath rest, and let the chapel watch, and if the crown must gaze forward, let it do so while still bending once a year." Corin looked at the paper, folded it, put it in his jacket, and tapped it once against his chest. "That's not nostalgia," he said softly. "That's an order." He left the room without asking anyone's permission. The printers behind him started to hum again, printing out programs for events that weren't nearly as important. It had rained overnight, not a storm, just enough to soak through wool and make things look fuzzy. The stones in the courtyard were wet, with shallow water filling in the ridges and reflecting the chapel windows in shaky pieces. Corin got there just after 5 and froze. The chairs were stacked, the wreaths were gone, and the velvet ropes were in boxes. The memorial platform that was built for her every October was half torn down, its frame showing like a half-buried skeleton. 2 junior contractors were struggling to fit a folded banner into a service trolley. Another was taking the ceremonial cords off the flagpole, and none of them looked like they knew what they were doing. Corin's boots hit the stone like a starting gun. The workmen glanced up in shock. One of them, who was just 20, lost the tie rope he was carrying. "Who told you to do it?" Corin yelled. The older man went forward with a clipboard in hand. "We were advised to leave the area. Advice from estate operations. Memorial no longer needed for public visibility." Those were the statements. "Public visibility," Corin said again. His voice didn't get louder, it got tighter and sharper. This wasn't a chance for the media. She was in charge of this. The man swallowed. "We're just going along with the modernization plans, sir. We were only informed that." Corin quietly went nearer. "Do you think that modernizing implies forgetting who made these stones?" Another worker moved closer to the trolley. Corin stepped in front of him, planting his boots on the damp flagstone in front of the church stairs. "You take one more thing off this ground," he continued coldly, "and you'll have to answer for it, in front of someone who knew her better than you ever will." The men halted. The courtyard was quiet. Then they heard footsteps they knew. Curator Halberd came out from under the east arch, wearing a raincoat and holding a binder tightly. When he spotted Corin, his face twitched. "Sergeant Ashwell," he added softly, "let's not make this worse. We aren't going against anything. This is just how things are done." Corin's brows furrowed. "Then let protocol look me in the eye and say it." Halberd paused. "The Queen Consort has started to change how royal events are held. Things change. We're not going to forget about her. We're just bringing the living monarchy back into the spotlight." "She was the living monarchy," he added, "every day for 70 years, and now she gets filed under unnecessary." Corin gazed past him to the stack of broken chairs and the empty area where the wreath should have been. Halberd moved about uneasily. "We're not talking about legacy, Sergeant." "Good," Corin responded. "I'm not going to argue either. I'm on guard." The workers stood quiet. Halberd looked at them, then at Corin again. He noticed something in the sergeant's stance that made him back up 2 steps without meaning to. He whispered, "I'll talk to the royal office, but you're getting close to being disobedient." Corin didn't answer. Halberd turned around and walked away. The men with the trolley followed, not sure if they were being let go or spared. Corin stood alone in the middle of the courtyard, rain lightly tapping on his shoulders. The chapel windows behind him glowed faintly gold in the distance, and all of the guards had stopped moving, watching him and waiting. No one said a word, but by nightfall the phrase would reach every hallway of Windsor. The cold stream refused the Queen Consort's order. The rain stopped just before noon, but the air didn't lighten. Clouds hung low over Windsor like a ceiling that hadn't been finished. The courtyard remained mostly empty, save for the rows of stacked chairs that hadn't been touched again since Corin's intervention. Then the gates opened. 2 Range Rovers rolled in slowly, unhurried, like they had every right to be late. The first stopped near the chapel entrance. The second, smaller and glossier, curved toward the courtyard center and came to a halt beside the disassembled memorial base. The back door opened. Queen Camilla stepped out with the grace of someone used to being observed. Her coat was bone white, sharply tailored, with a brooch the size of a sovereign pinned high on the collar. Her gloves were cream. Her smile was polite, in the way a scalpel is sterile. 2 press liaisons followed behind her, tablets in hand. A third aide carried a small camera drone box, sealed. She didn't acknowledge the guards, didn't glance at the chapel. She looked directly at Corin. "Sergeant Ashwell," she said as she walked up. "You've made quite a statement." Corin stayed at attention. "Mom, I've done my duty." She stopped just short of him. "This show of grief is too much. People need to see strength, not sadness." Corin's face didn't change. "Strength doesn't fear memory." Camilla's eyes sharpened. "The monarchy can't stay in her shadow forever," he answered in a calm voice. "Then step out." The aides behind her froze. One of them gently closed the drone case. Camilla tilted her head and said, "You forget your place, Sergeant." "No, Mom," Corin said in a cold voice. "I know exactly who handed it to me." She made another step and was now only inches away from him. "You're making an old woman's rule sound romantic." He didn't move. "That old woman wore the crown longer than you've worn the jewelry." Gasping, one of the aides took a deep breath. Even the soldiers at the chapel entrance shifted, not in horror but in support. Camilla's lips parted, not to speak, but as if something had suddenly hit her that she hadn't seen coming. Her face hardened. "You've gone too far," she said in a low voice. Corin stayed completely still. "And you've erased one." She turned quickly and waved for her contact. "Get ready for a formal inquiry. He'll feel better by sunset." She didn't say anything else and marched back to the car. One of the aides stayed just long enough to look at Corin. He said, "You'll regret this." Corin's answer was low, steady, and clear. "Not as much as she will." The doors of the Range Rover closed and the engine started. Just like that, Camilla left the courtyard. She wasn't happy or angry, she was hurt. She wasn't in power, she was in pride. The sound of the cars faded, and the courtyard fell still again. One of the junior guards closest to the chapel leaned a little toward Corin. "What do we do now?" he asked in a low voice. Corin didn't say anything. He merely stood his position and glanced at the memorial base. It wasn't an interrogation room that they put him in. That would have made things easier. It was a guest conference suite in the East Wing, with a polished walnut table, leather chairs, and a framed picture of the royal gardens in full bloom. It was a place for polite demotions. Corin sat quietly, his cap neatly on the table in front of him, and his gloves folded next to it, undisturbed. A Windsor administrative officer across from him flicked through a file with the calm efficiency of someone who had been told how to deal with him but not why. "Sergeant," the guy stated without looking up, "Her Majesty's office has asked for a formal pause on your active rotation. This isn't punishment. It's just a matter of procedure." "Not following a directive from the Queen Consort's press secretary," the man added as he pushed a page forward. Corin remarked in a low voice, "Not a directive, a suggestion, without a seal, paper, or even a single spine to carry it." The man blinked, and then glanced down again. "We have been told to look at your behavior for tone, interference, and reputational exposure." Corin leaned forward slowly. "Reputational exposure," he said again. "You're worried that I made it clear that someone tried to cancel a Queen's order." "Sergeant." Corin's voice got sharper. "You can't put off reverence. You don't change memory. She told him one thing to do before she died. One, and they're trying to bury it under polite press." The officer moved around, seeming uneasy. "I'm simply here to get the paperwork, Sergeant. This isn't about being faithful. Optics is what it's about." Corin stood up and said, "Then we've already lost." The officer sprang up, shocked. "You're not dismissed." "I'm not asking," Corin said. He picked up his hat and turned to leave. His boots echoed in the empty room like punctuation. He stopped at the door and reached into his jacket. He took out the Queen's handwritten note, carefully unfolded it, and put it on the table in front of the officer, not with anger, but with care. "Read it," he urged out loud, "if you can still breathe." The officer didn't move. Corin looked at him one last time before leaving. He walked down the east corridor in silence, past paintings of kings and queens who didn't need cameras to prove their worth. With every step he took, he felt something older than policy, and older than the woman in the ivory coat trying to change history. He took the memorial ribbon out of his locker, ironed it, and pinned it to his jacket when he got back to his room. The clouds outside were getting thinner. He looked out over the chapel roof, where the wreath was supposed to go, and where her window was still waiting. Then he said softly, "Then bow we shall." He would remember her, even if no one else did, especially if he was alone. The courtyard was empty by nightfall. The tourists were gone, and the aides had gone back to their wine and denial. The brass doors of the royal chapel were closed, and the flag above Windsor hung limp in the still air. But Corin came back. He had no orders, no escort, and no audience. He was in full dress uniform, with polished boots and buttons that glimmered faintly under the arc lamps that lined the courtyard walls. He carried a wreath that was not official, not the gold-trimmed one that the royal household sent every year, and was now probably thrown away in some forgotten storeroom. The castle gardeners made this one out of lavender, rosemary, and thistle, tied with a single black ribbon. Corin walked it to the chapel steps and laid it at the center. Then he stepped back and stood at attention. The silence was complete. Rain misted lightly through the air again, soft and slow, making everything shimmer without sound. He stayed still. 5 minutes went by, then 10. Then another person came, a young guardsman who wasn't on duty, Private Evering, who had just come from Sandhurst, and was still too stiff in the shoulders. He didn't say anything as he took his place to Corin's left. Corporal Denham joined, and then 2 more. The cold stream was ready in less than 20 minutes. No orders, no commands, just formation. Word had spread, not through official channels, but through boots, whispers, and the kind of loyalty that didn't need to be signed. A single line of guards stood shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead beneath the stone arches. A royal attendant came sprinting from the west hallway, panting because of the weight of his coat. He halted when he spotted them and said, "This wasn't authorized. You're all in trouble." Corin didn't turn his head. "You'll be caught, marshaled for this," the aide warned, his voice getting higher. But Corin didn't say anything until he eventually answered, "Then I'll march out in formation." The aide looked at the faces in front of him, every one of them blunt, steady, unshaken. He stepped back as if the sight itself had pushed him. One of the guards, without breaking line, quietly lowered a lit candle to the chapel steps. Then another. Within minutes, the base of the Queen's chapel was glowing, not with floodlights, but with reverence. A quiet rebellion, not against monarchy, against manipulation. One that needed no slogans, no banners, no fanfare, only presence. The aide disappeared into the darkness. Whether he ran or reported, no one knew, and no one cared. Because in that moment, what stood in the courtyard wasn't insubordination. It was remembrance made visible. Rain traced down their coats. Boots held firm in the puddles forming around them. Corin stared ahead, jaw locked, breath slow. He hadn't needed permission to stand here. He only needed conviction. And right now he had more of that than anyone else in the castle. The sound of tires on wet stone echoed across the courtyard like a second heartbeat. A Range Rover rolled through the south gate. No escort, no livery, no announcement, just one vehicle, one driver, and one woman in the back seat. It stopped directly across from the chapel, headlights washing the formation of guards in muted gold. The rear door opened. Princess Anne stepped out into the drizzle without waiting for assistance. Her coat was waxed, dark green, belted at the waist, riding trousers. Mud still clung to her boots. She looked like she'd come straight from the saddle, and maybe she had. Her eyes moved once across the courtyard, from the wreath to the candles, to the guards, to Corin. Then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and stepped forward without a word. A moment later, the sound of another engine reached the square. Camilla's car. It was faster and more stylish. A second car followed behind, with aides and security details getting out before the Queen Consort even touched the handle. When she got out, she moved with practiced stiffness. She didn't have an umbrella, just certainty, until she saw Anne and stopped. "Anne," she answered calmly. "I didn't know you were coming." Anne didn't answer. She looked back at the wreath and studied the ribbon. Camilla tried again. This wasn't allowed. Anne stood up straight. It didn't have to be. Camilla's voice got stronger. "They're planning a mutiny." "No, they're staging remembrance," Anne said softly. Camilla looked at the formation, which was calm and perfect. "This is a break in the chain of command." Anne moved closer. "You broke a royal tradition with a spoken recommendation, and no seal. That's not a command. That's being a coward." The aides gasped. Camilla's jaw moved. "I was just changing old customs," Anne remarked in a flat voice. "You were rewriting the only thing she asked us to keep." Camilla opened her lips, but Anne didn't wait. She turned to Corin. "Sergeant." Corin took a step forward, standing perfectly straight. Anne put out her hand, and Corin took the folded paper out of his breast pocket and delicately placed it in her palm. She slowly and methodically unfolded it and read it out loud. "Let us have one moment each year, when we don't talk, don't explain, don't frame, just remember." Anne gazed up at Camilla. She didn't want to be frightened. She just wanted to be remembered. "And you couldn't even give her that." Camilla's voice got lower. "You don't have the power to change." Anne interrupted. "I have every right to do so. I was there when she wrote it. Because I was there when she buried Philip. Because I know how heavy duty is better than you know how heavy that brooch is." Anne turned back to the chapel and said, "The memorial is to stay up forever, protected, recorded, and not able to be changed." She stared at Corin again. "You've reminded the crown why it stands," she murmured. Corin didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The guards behind him stayed still, not out of fear, but out of loyalty. Camilla didn't say anything else. She turned around and walked back to the car without saying a word. Her aides followed her, not sure whether to leave or apologize. The doors closed, the engines rolled away, and the courtyard was quiet again, except for the candles and the Queen's note, which was now in Anne's coat pocket right above her heart. Dawn broke clean over Windsor. The sky was pale but open, the kind of morning light that made wet stone look like polished glass. For the first time in days, There was no rain. Only the soft hush of wind moving between towers, brushing gently over the courtyard. The wreath still lay at the base of the chapel steps, untouched. The candles had burned low through the night, their wax melted into quiet pools along the edge of the stone. Someone, no one knew who, had gathered the half-burnt stubs and placed them neatly in a silver dish beside the door. Corin was back at his post, standing alone again. There was no ceremony, no orders, just a name quietly returned to the duty log and a polished uniform waiting for him outside his locker at first light. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. The Queen's window caught the sun for the first time in weeks. It refracted across the stone tiles in soft bands, casting a faint crown-shaped shadow beside the base of the memorial. A young guard from yesterday's vigil came up to Corin. His boots were quieter than usual. He remained next to Corin for a moment before saying, "Was it worth the risk?" Corin didn't look at him. "It depends on what you're guarding," he murmured. The younger man nodded but didn't say anything else. He stood there for another minute before going back to his place. The chapel bells rang once, not for show or mourning, just once. It was slow, measured, and final. A single note traveled across the courtyard and into the still air like the last breath of something too dignified to announce itself. Corin stood still, shoulders squared and eyes forward. He didn't think about his suspension or Camilla. Instead, he thought about the first vigil after the Queen died. It had been so cold, and everyone had stood so still. Not one soldier had blinked while Anne laid the wreath herself. Every year after that, the ceremony had gotten quieter and more precise, until now, it would never be touched again, not because it had been made permanent by press release or decree, but because someone had finally tried to erase it and failed. Corin's fingers brushed once against the pin at his chest, the same ribbon the Queen had given him when she reviewed his company after Helmond. Faded now, but still holding. He shifted his weight, not out of fatigue, but out of peace, because the Queen's memory wasn't defended in speeches, it was defended by standing still. Should Queen Camilla have cancelled the Queen's memorial in the name of modernization, would you have stood your ground like Sergeant Ashwell, even if it meant losing your job and your name? Let us know what you would have done. We read every comment. If you believe that loyalty should never go out of style, tap the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next Royal Guard story. Share this video with someone who still remembers what the Queen stood for and still believes that some traditions shouldn't be changed. Watch another Royal Guard story now, and we'll see you tomorrow at the same time, right?